For many years, it seemed like the UFC was a better product compared to boxing. I know that boxing is an entire sport, while the UFC is a mixed martial arts promotion, but come on, UFC is the premier MMA organization, and I'd argue that people have heard the term UFC more than MMA at this point. Anyway, it appeared like the UFC had boxing's number and Dana White was continually putting on matches that people wanted to see. On the other hand, aside from a few blockbuster fights, boxing was stagnant from 2016 until 2023, I'd say. We had the Mayweather vs Pacquiao fight in 2015, but even then, they were not in their prime whatsoever, and age is such a big factor in the smaller weight divisions compared to heavyweight, for example. For the most part though, in the 2010s, the best boxers from each division weren't fighting each other for one reason or another, and too much politics got in the way of matchmaking. The money wasn't right for the fighters. There were, and still are by the way, too many sanctioning bodies and belts on the line, and the buzz for boxing wasn't there like it was for the UFC. Conor McGregor, one of the most popular combat athletes of all time, was at the peak of his powers in the UFC at the time and took the world by storm. That didn't help boxing's case either. Now, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. Boxing was not dead by any stretch, and there were still fighters with a ton of star power making big events happen. Canelo, Triple G, Inoue, and more. That being said, UFC was kicking its ass in terms of relevance and just general interest. Conor had a lot to do with that, but still, the UFC's hype was accelerating at a rapid rate in the 2010s, while boxing was sinking a bit. I know. Anthony Joshua vs Vladimir Klitschko. Wilder vs Fury. Juan Marquez vs Manny Pacquiao. These are all big fights to come from the 2010s, but it felt like these are the exceptions, not the rule. Not consistent blockbuster fights like we have now. Flash forward to 2024, and boxing is in the best place it's been for a while now. Full disclosure, I'm only 24. I don't have memories of Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, Joe Calzaghe, Floyd Mayweather, and Nassim Hamed fighting on television. Some of the greatest boxers of all time, some of the most celebrated and watched athletes in history, and I'm unable to give a proper context of how awesome they were because I wasn't alive then. I don't have the full context. I can read retrospectives, articles, watch old footage, and learn about these fighters, but I can never really talk about boxing's golden eras and why they were great correctly because I wasn't around. They weren't my eras, and it would feel disingenuous if I brought up how boxing was better back then, because it wasn't back in my day. When I grew up, the UFC was all the rage, and boxing felt a bit ancient by comparison. Nowadays though, while MMA and the UFC are still quality products, boxing is becoming my preferred sport out of the two. What changed exactly? A few things from both sports, to be honest. I'll start with boxing and how Saudi Arabia has taken over the sport. Yes, the Saudis dumping money into boxing events and making them take place inside the kingdom is a blatant example of sports washing, no question about it. Google defines sports washing the best, so let's just use that to explain what it means. Sports washing is a term used to describe the practice of nations, individuals, groups, corporations, and governments using sports to improve reputation tarnished by wrongdoing. This has happened a few times in boxing. Muhammad Ali vs George Foreman in the Congo, Thriller in Manila set in the Philippines obviously, and also the fight that more or less kicked off this Saudi boxing merger, the Anthony Joshua vs Andy Ruiz rematch. Sports washing is of course not a great thing, and the Saudi government should not be violating human rights. However, I'm not a political pundit, and I have no real idea about the inner goings-on in Saudi Arabia. Similar to how I can't give an accurate perspective on boxing decades I wasn't alive for. So, with that said, let's talk about Saudi's role in the sport of boxing exclusively. They've made it flourish, to be honest. Matchups that we actually want are getting made now because there is enough money on the table for both fighters and promoters. Speaking of promoters, Frank Warren and Eddie Hearn are getting along and making fights with boxers in their respective stables. They even have a Matchroom vs Queensberry card coming up, which is super exciting. We are getting more and more fights that actually matter in each division, undisputed fights like Bivol vs Beterbiev and Usyk vs Fury. Turki Al-Sheikh, the chairman of the General Entertainment Authority in Saudi Arabia, is the one responsible for this drastic improvement to the sport. He seems to genuinely have a love of boxing, and yeah, that's super evident with the matchmaking he has been doing recently. Most of the Saudi-backed boxing fights we see nowadays have high stakes, and they are actually competitive. Nobody knew for certain who was going to win out of Fury and Usyk this past weekend or so. Compare that to Tyson Fury vs Dillian Whyte from 2022, and it's a stark contrast. Aside from the Saudi Arabia collaboration, it feels like we have way more superstars in the sport now. Yes, we had the big Mayweather and Canelo fights last decade, but there's so many more interesting characters nowadays than before. And guess what? They don't need to be undefeated to be worth watching. Anthony Joshua has had 3 losses, and he's at the top of his game in terms of skill, and I'd argue likability as well. Ryan Garcia is such a head case with a KO loss against Gervonta Davis, but you also can't take your eyes off him both in the ring and outside of it. The undefeated streak doesn't matter anymore in boxing, and to give credit to the other side, that's a philosophy that the UFC has always championed. You don't have to be unbeaten to be interesting or a great fighter. There's still things that annoy the shit out of me in boxing, too many belts, hardly any stacked cards, etc. But more and more, boxing is doing wonders. So boxing has improved for the better, but what about MMA and more specifically the UFC organization? Well, I just think that boxing has improved so much as a sport these last couple of years that it's kind of outshining MMA at the moment. It's not like the UFC has been suddenly terrible in 2024, not at all in fact. The UFC is a well-oiled machine that delivers consistently solid cards with skilled, entertaining fighters. It's a great product that actually gives fans what they want more often than not. Each division is fairly stacked currently, with welterweight being my personal favorite weight class, featuring an excellent mix of veterans and a high number of top prospects. That being said, apart from a Conor McGregor fight, it's hard to top the likes of Crawford vs Spence or the Fury vs Wilder trilogy in terms of hype. Thanks to Saudi Arabia, these mega fights in boxing are happening on a constant basis now, and I've got to say that the biggest boxing matches feel more monumental than the biggest UFC fights, barring Conor McGregor cards obviously. UFC is more consistent, but boxing has higher highs usually. Saudi has more or less eliminated the bullshit promoter politics in boxing, and if anything, I'd argue that the politics have kind of ramped up in the UFC actually. The heavyweight division is the marquee boxing weight class in 2024, where it's the exact opposite in the UFC thanks to the stupid politics. John Jones should be stripped of the heavyweight belt or he should fight Tom Aspinall in his next fight. There's no way he should be fighting Stipe over the interim champion. Even when you take into account all of the accomplishments John has achieved in a completely separate weight class, mind you. It's absolute bullshit and it's grinding the UFC heavyweight division to a fucking halt. The contract negotiations with Conor McGregor and the organization not getting him to fight on a regular basis for the past year, even the past year and a half, is yet another can of worms. Keeping that in mind, these are fairly contained issues, and for the most part, the UFC is a consistent product like I said before. You typically get all the fights you want before guys are past their prime. As for the superstars in the UFC, aside from Conor McGregor, there isn't anyone who has crossed over into the mainstream. There are stars within the sport like Sean O'Malley, but the crossover appeal isn't there. You could levy the same criticism at boxing even nowadays though. In terms of production, boxing has MMA's number right now. The ring walks, the glitz and glamour, the Saudi-backed cinematic trailers. This is how the UFC should be marketing their fighters. I'd argue that the UFC has more engaging stars that can actually talk to a camera coherently without saying, "I'd fight him every day and twice on Sunday," but when referring to the actual event's production, boxing wins all day long. To wrap up, the UFC is a fantastic, consistent product that has a variety of stars and compelling matchups. Their talent scouting is second to none, the fights that need to get made in the UFC usually do get made, and again, the UFC is a well-oiled machine. Boxing was kinda down and out for a long while, barring a handful of noteworthy fights, but it's come back with a vengeance thanks to Turkey. When Conor McGregor is fighting, there's nothing else like it. When there's an undisputed boxing title fight on for all the marbles, there's nothing else like it. There are some aspects that I prefer in boxing now, and the same goes for UFC. One thing that I do love though in regards to both sports is the amount of crossover we have at the moment with MMA and boxing. It seems like combat sports fans as a whole are enjoying both products, as they're both firing on all fronts now. Even the circus fights, Ngannou vs Fury, Mayweather vs McGregor, these fights bring bickering and debate from MMA and boxing fans alike. But most importantly, it brings them together to discuss two of the greatest sports in the world. Boxing vs UFC. The decision is in.